LAWCHA. Greetings, members and friends. Welcome to the LAWCHA at the OAH and to this very special presidential address. My name is Joe McCartan. I think I know most people here, but it's a pleasure to be among you. As you know, it's our custom to invite the immediate past president, who has just stepped down from her term, to address LAWCHA with a kind of valedictory address. And today we're in for a real treat, because that president is Cindy Hahamovitch, whose term has just ended. Yeah. To her great relief. I got an email from her on the morning it happened. I didn't know it had happened yet. I'm done. But how much she accomplished. What a term Cindy had. I would say that we've been blessed over the years to have some enormously talented and important and accomplished presidents, from our first Jackie Dowd Hall and Joe Trotter and Jim Green, down to the most recent three who have held this office: Julie, Green, Will, and Cindy. During Cindy's 2-year term, just an enormous amount was accomplished. I don't want to take up the time that should go to her talk with recounting everything, but just let me say a few things that she did get done for us. One is that she totally revamped our website, and I think if you haven't looked at it, it's an amazing improvement on what we had, and with it the updating and improvement of Labor Online, teaching Labor Story, and other aspects of how we communicate digitally. She led us in hosting what I think was in holding one of the most successful conferences we've had at Rutgers last April, which, as Naomi well knows, was accomplished under enormously stressful circumstances, as everybody remembers, because of the strike that went right up to the edge of it.
Successful strike.
It was always cool. I would hear from her sometimes at 1 in the morning, but they were always very calm emails. We got through that thanks to her leadership. At that conference, we had an immensely successful grad student organizing workshop, which I think has planted seeds for the future. We identified our next conference site, which will be in Chicago in 2025. We'll hear a little bit more about that shortly. Under Cindy's leadership, LAWCHA became a sponsor and a promoter of Labor Spring, the event that has led to like 130 or 40 now events on college campuses over the past year or so. And thank you, Lane, for your work on that. And she's led moral support, and LAWCHA has, to new initiatives like the Labor History Resource Project. The list goes on, but again, I don't want to eat into her time, just to say that this has been one of the most, I think, significant and impactful presidencies we've had in LAWCHA's history. About Cindy herself, I think not much needs to be said that isn't known to all of you. She got her PhD in 1992 at UNC, working under Leon Fink, one of the great leaders of our field and the founding editor of our journal, Labor. She published 2 immensely influential books: The Fruits of Their Labor, Atlantic Coast Farm Workers and the Making of Migrant Poverty, and No Man's Land, Jamaica Guest Workers in the American and the Global History of Deportable Labor, which won 3 huge awards: the Raleigh Award for the best book in U.S. race relations from the OAH, the Merle Purdy Award, another OAH award for the best book in U.S. social history, and of course our own award, the Taft Prize. Those 3 prizes, I would say, are kind of the historian's equivalent of the EGOT. So Cindy is in rare company. She's been a Guggenheim Fellow, a Fulbright Fellow, a John Sawyer Fellow at the National Humanities Center. She's also past president of the Southern Labor Studies Conference. In short, Cindy is just been a force in our field, and we're lucky to have had her leadership. Her address today is intriguingly entitled, "That Same Old Snake, One Very Modern Historian's Search for Answers in the Distant Past." So it's my honor to welcome Cindy Hahamovitch.
Thank you so much. I want to start by thanking people, especially Joe, who's just been incredible as a vice president, the executive committee, Eric Gilman, Will Jones, and where's Liesl? Liesl's here. Liesl Arden. I also want to thank our amazing conference organizers, where Naomi goes over here, Jesse Wilkerson. It was a crazy time, but you guys made it incredibly smooth, and it was a wonderful conference. I also want to thank Heidi Selby from the OAH, who makes this stuff happen. I tried to get her to stay so we could bow down to her, but she wouldn't. She said, "I get paid for this," and off she went. And also Beth English, who is the executive director of the OAH, and my first PhD student so far. So, and special thanks to those of you who volunteered your time and your money. Do that. Go back. What? Swear to God, it wasn't me. Wow. I can do this in the dark.
Did we have?
Thank you. So I was saying thanks so much to those of you who volunteered your time or your money or both over the last 2 years. We really appreciate you. All right. I did not intend to write another book about guest workers. I swear, I really didn't. And then I was Googling something and I accidentally read about a story. And I thought, okay, here we go again. So I'm going to start with that, a little piece of that story, and then take it from there. In early 2006, after Hurricane Katrina, Ebi Raju noticed a want ad in a major newspaper in Kerala in India. There we go. It advertised jobs for first-class welders and fitters in a US-based company, but what caught his eye was the rather vague statement, temporary visa/permanent residence. Now, Ebi, first names are commonly used as we would last names in Kerala, so Ebi. Ebi called a number to confirm that those who got jobs were really going to get green cards, and he was assured by the recruiter, whose name goes by Solomon, that they would. And better yet, Solomon told him that after a couple of years, the recruits would be able to get green cards for their wives and children, which was a major selling point for most of the workers who went out. Ebi didn't have a wife and a child at the time, but most of the men who would ultimately take the company up on this offer had already worked in the Persian Gulf, and you can't bring your family to the Persian Gulf. You go on your own, and you might see your kids 1 month, 2 months out of the year. So the idea of getting to go to a place where you can live with your family and make good money was exciting. Solomon was subcontracting for a recruitment company called Dewan Consultants, which was recruiting for a Mississippi deputy sheriff named Michael Paul, who was recruiting for an American oil rig company called Signal International. Now, Signal was a small, relatively small, non-union shipyard, and it had lost roughly half its workforce to the chaos after Hurricane Katrina and Rita. They didn't die, they just dispersed. You know, people are working on their houses, or they moved far away, or they're getting better pay doing reconstruction work. And its managers were able to get US workers to take their place, but they got them through US labor recruiters who tack an enormous amount of money on per hour. Now, Signal, because it was essentially a repairing oil rigs, was basically selling man hours. So if they're selling man hours to an oil company for, say, $50 an hour, and they're having to pay $36 or $40 to hire somebody from elsewhere in the US, they're not going to make enough of a profit. And they'll be in serious trouble. Now, interestingly, just down the road, like 2 miles away, was the Ingalls shipyard, which is much bigger. They made Navy ships, and they were unionized. There were about 12 unions in the one yard. It's kind of like a 19th century steel mill. And its unions were able to advertise through their channels whenever there was a position open. So Ingalls didn't have the same problem that Signal had. They essentially had a union hiring hall, or 12 union hiring halls. Now, Signal could not do that, or would not do that. So its managers made arrangements to have Michael Paul, the deputy sheriff, Sasha Dewan of Dewan Consultants, and an immigration lawyer named Malvin Burnett of New Orleans to deliver skilled Indian workers to the company's door at minimal cost to Signal. Now for Eddie, this was an exciting prospect, but as an experienced welder who had spent several years in Bahrain and who had friends who had worked in many different countries in the world, he was cautious. Right? He did his research, and he called his uncle, who had also worked abroad, for advice. And it turned out that not only did his uncle know Salman, the recruiter, but they had roomed together when they both worked for a shipyard company in Saudi Arabia. So they all got together, and Salman assured Eddie that his then uncle that this was no scam, that the recruitment fees were huge, $18,000 was a lifetime of savings for somebody like Eddie, but he'd be earning $5,000 a month between his regular wages and overtime, and so paying back that recruitment fee seemed feasible. At a recruitment seminar in Hilton Hotel Auditorium in Kochi, Eddie sat among hundreds of others listening closely to a representative from Signal International, whose English was translated into Malayalam and Hindi. They watched a slideshow about the company and met the American immigration lawyer, Malvin Burnett, who the workers always say Malvin C. Burnett, who would arrange their green cards through a program called PERM. So Eddie applied, and he returned again to Kochi for a welding test, and then he passed it, and he paid the first third of the $18,000 fee, with the help of his father, who was a retired Army veteran, who put up his house and his pension and his wife's gold wedding jewelry, which is a big thing in India, to get a loan so that Eddie could go, and his uncles and aunts contributed cash, and Eddie contributed his savings. And then he married a nurse named Bitsy Jacob, who his parents had chosen for him. And after several months, as his family was starting to pay the interest-only loan, which many of these loans were 18%, 20%, 24% compounding interest, Salman called to tell him go to Chennai for an appointment at the U.S. consulate. And he warned him not to mention the recruitment fees. That concerned Eddie, but Salman said, this is just how it's done. And if you talk about the money, you're not going to go, and none of these men are going to be able to go. And we can promise that your money will be returned to you. So in the end, he went, and fees never came up. The consular officials was only concerned that his passport had gotten wet in the rain as he waited in the line to get into the consulate. He had to go get another passport, come back later. That was it. The consular official then kept Eddie's passport, so there was no going to Bahrain or anywhere else while he waited for the American job. All he could do was pay the next third of the recruitment fee and wait. Finally, on December 15th, 2006, after months of waiting, during which Bitsy got pregnant, Eddie got a call from Salman, who said that Eddie was to leave for the United States in 2 days. But first, he had to go to Dewan Consulting in Mumbai pay the remainder of the recruitment fee in cash, collect his passport and visa, and then get on the plane. And it was at Dewan Consulting that Eddie and many others realized that something was truly not right. When he got his passport, it didn't say anything about a permanent visa or a green card. It was stamped H-2B, which is the U.S.'s seasonal non-agricultural guest worker program. And it was a 10-month visa, but 3 of those months had already expired. So we had 7 months left on the visa. He was assured by Sasha Dewan that it's okay, this is going to be renewed twice, and then they'll do the green card application and you'll get your green card. The guy behind Eddie was not so sanguine. He asked for his money back, and Sasha, who was surrounded by bodyguards, threatened to throw him out of the office without returning the $12,000 he had already paid. So that man, and Eddie, and all the others paid the rest of the money and went to the airport and got on the plane. And they flew from Mumbai to Germany, to Chicago, to Houston, and when they arrived in Houston, they were divided into 2 groups. They're all men. One bus went to Signals Yard in Orange, Texas. That's where Eddie went. And the other bus went to Signal International Shipyard in Pascagoula, Mississippi. To their surprise, when they got to the shipyards, they didn't get taken to apartment buildings. They got taken into the yard's fence and dropped in front of the trailers where they were going to live, the man camps, as the Signal called them. Sometimes they called them the reservation. Get it? Indians camp. Now these workers were not, oh sorry, this is one of the documents they got about the green cards. These are not the sort of workers that we read about who work in construction in the Persian Gulf. The men who work in barracks like these, who die from heat stroke and other, injuries at just huge numbers. The guys I'm writing about are not those guys. These guys are so skilled with metal that they're considered sort of the aristocracy of labor in the Persian Gulf because they keep the oil inside the pipelines. Without them, these companies would lose billions. And so they lived in apartments in the Middle East. They had, one told me about wireless headphones they had so they could each watch a different TV in a different language. They went to cafeterias provided by the company that catered to their regional cuisine, South India, North India, the Philippines, and so forth. So when they got to Signal and they walked into the trailers that Signal provided at both camps, now they were certain that something was wrong. Because each trailer, here's the camp from above, you can see the cluster of the trailers and the little white clump in the front there. But they looked just like the housing that we've seen in Qatar and Bahrain and Saudi Arabia and so forth. Each man was assigned a number. I'm told that's how they would be known. Eddie's number was 100. He got a top bunk, and he could barely sit up without hitting his head on the ceiling. And he had to share his bunk with his luggage because there was no other place to store it. Things went downhill from there. The next day, he and the others were told to sign employment contracts, which were then backdated, so it looked like they had signed them in India. When workers balked, they were told that they didn't have to sign, but they'd be sent back to India. When they signed, they consented to a deduction from their pay of over $1,000 per month in rent for a bunk bed. Worse, the supervisors professed to know absolutely nothing about the green cards. Now, they were all issued Social Security cards, but with stickers on them that said they could only work for Signal International. Now, at $18.50 an hour, the pay was as promised, but it was not enough to pay $1,000 a month in rent and his family's expenses back home and the loans, or at least interest on the loans. So the workers in Pascagoula hiked over to a Catholic church and asked for help and were put in touch with an attorney from the Southern Poverty Law Center. And they began having meetings. 3 months later, Eddie and his co-workers in Texas learned what happened in Pascagoula. On March 7th, 2007, the company decided to deport 7 men. 5 of them allegedly because their skills weren't up to par, but 2 because they were the leaders of the organizing at the Pascagoula camp. And in utter despair, one of the men, who was one of these leaders, went into a bathroom, got a razor, and cut his wrist 3 times. And that stopped everything. The rest of the workers stopped work, started yelling, started stomping, started to get the workers that were being held out of the room where they were being guarded by security guards. They took the injured man to the hospital, and they dictated a statement on the phone to the Southern Poverty Law Center attorney, J.J. Rosenbaum. The next day, Signal's vice president held a meeting with the workers in Mississippi, which one of the workers taped, during which he told the men that if they filed a lawsuit, no more visas would be issued. And hearing about this from Texas, Ebby and the others started to hold secret meetings every day. Okay. That's not the part of the story that I found surprising. That part of the story is utterly ordinary. This happens all the time. There are so many guest worker schemes that devolve into force, fraud, or coercion, which has been our definition of human trafficking since the year 2000. But 90% of U.S. guest workers report mistreatment or fraud somewhere along the supply chain, the human supply chain, including men like this guy from Peru who worked as an H2A herder on the top of a mountain in Colorado without heat. That's the housing, no running water, $2 an hour pay. Right? Now, I was an expert witness in that human trafficking case and in 5 others, but they were, again, ordinary. And many of the details in those cases are much worse than the details in the Signal case. In fact, there was a case, a huge case in South Georgia in the onion fields just 2 years ago that is unbelievably nasty, and we can talk about it later. So this just happens all the time. What made this case different to me was the remarkable social movement that the workers built with the help of the New Orleans Workers Center, which has an exhibit up during the conference, and just in solidarity with each other. In the months after Black Friday, which is what workers called the attempted forced deportation, it became clear that Malvern Burnett, the immigration attorney, had never submitted the next step of the PERM process. In fact, when workers went to see him, to see what's going on with these green cards, he charged them for the appointment, and he asked them for another $2,000 to process their paperwork. So with their visas expiring again and no prospect of permanent residency, hundreds of men staged a walkout, sang "We Shall Overcome" in Malayalam, talked openly to the press against the express advice of their attorneys, and then they traveled to DC despite obvious ICE surveillance, walking famous civil rights routes along the way during the day and sleeping on the buses at night. They talked to church congregations, they talked to unions, they talked to civil rights organizations. Ebby testified before Congress, before a congressional committee, and at a human rights commission in New York, which is where I met him. The workers, who ultimately numbered 590, they were still coming throughout this whole period, bailed each other out of immigration detention, went on hunger strike in Washington, D.C., in order to get Americans to see a bunch of muscular, mustachioed men as human trafficking victims. It was a pretty hard sell. And to get federal officials to grant them the T visas, which had been made possible by the year 2000 Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which are supposed to go to victims of human trafficking so that they could help bring cases against their employers. And they ultimately got that. By the time Ebby met his son, he was 4.5 to go on time. And they learned that while in the process, that while the PERM program was real, the recruiters weren't making it up. It might have taken 15 to 30 years for those green cards to come through. A period where they were supposed to be waiting in India. So the day they walked out of the compound and threw up their helmets in the air, they sued Signal International and the recruiters in a case that involved the Southern Poverty Law Center leading the charge, but also multiple NGOs and at least 10 private law firms working on a pro bono basis, and the first of multiple groups because the judge broke up the class action. Won their jury trial in 2012, and then the whole gang won a settlement, $20 million. No doubt the biggest human trafficking judgment in the US and I would guess the world. So this case is widely celebrated as a triumph of the TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. Now, LAWCHA member Eric Arneson, who's not here today, who's my bud, who called me one of the most depressing labor historians. And so here, finally, was a success story. Like, woohoo! I could write a happy labor history story. So that's why I started doing it. How could I resist? But I'm a long durée kind of a gal. And I thought, well, I should put this story in the context of indentured migration out of India in the 19th century because it's kind of the same thing, right? Men working on contracts with bound to particular employers. This was the so-called coolie trade, right? And it moved millions of Indians around the world to British colonies on temporary labor contracts from the 1830s to the 1920s. And I knew from earlier research that indentured migration had led to the creation of guest worker programs in some places because indentured migrants could stay at the end of their contracts, unlike the guest workers. And their growing numbers led to nativist movements, and states intervened, right, by satisfying the employers who wanted the immigrant labor and satisfying the nativists who didn't want immigrants at all by offering people on a temporary basis, and that's where we get guest worker programs. And I couldn't help going back just a little further to the history of slavery in the British world, since it was the impending passage of the British Abolition Act of 1833 that led British plantation owners to scramble for workers that they could put into competition with emancipated slaves. So abolition led to indenture, and indenture led to guest work. And there's important differences among these labor supply systems, of course, but they all stem from that same old snake, right? The desire for profit. Joe's been waiting for me to tell him what the snake was. It's that snake from the Garden of Eden, right? All three systems were ways to solve employers' perennial problems. How do you secure a workforce? How do you control its costs? How do you get the people you bought, kidnapped, or enticed to keep from walking away from you once you've gotten them across an ocean at your expense? So I dove into the literature on slavery, indenture, and migration, intending to write just a little background section, maybe just a few pages. And I'm definitely an interloper in all these fields except the guest worker room, which is usually at a disadvantage, but there is sometimes an advantage to being able to sort of look from above, right, at fields that you don't know anything about. So just two asides. One is that I was struck by the fact that there's a pretty darn big literature on emancipation, right? And there's a pretty big literature on 19th century indenture, and they almost don't overlap. They rarely overlap. So there's a new book coming out by Jonathan Connolly, who I just met online, that does exactly that, but I was really struck by how separate. They're just written, you know, this topic is written by people who do the Indian diaspora, and this topic is written by people who do Black history. The second thing I noticed is that there's a really substantial history of slavery in the Middle East, and there's now a pretty big literature on guest workers in the Middle East, but nobody talks about the fact that guest workers replaced slaves in the Middle East in many industries. Slavery was still illegal in the UAE in the 1960s, and so domestic workers, guest workers who came as domestic workers or to do date farming or oil work replaced slaves in the Middle East. I found one line in one book that mentioned that. So sometimes doing global history is like, wow, somebody else fixed that. I'm not doing it. Okay. Most of the time, of course, I just felt over my head. Note the numbers on these 19th century indentured workers. One of the books that I read, as I read along, and my plan was just to read the secondary literature and call it a day, I read a book by a man named David Northrop. It's very well regarded, well reviewed, 1995, called Indentured Labor in the Age of Imperialism. And Northrop argues that indentured migration was indeed like slavery at the beginning. The death rates on the ships were comparable to the Atlantic slave trade. Workers on plantations were underfed, flogged, much like enslaved people. We could go on. But, he said, Britain imposed extensive reforms, and those reforms worked, making indentured migration pretty much indistinguishable from European migration across the Atlantic at around the same time. And I'm like, holy crap. Right? Sorry, is that? That stopped me in my tracks because I had spent the last, 15 years, 20 years documenting the US government's utter failure to regulate American guest worker programs. And by the end of indenture, the British controlled 23% of the world's population. And if they had solved the problem of moving people around that giant world and making sure that they weren't victims of force, fraud, and coercion, then we need to know what they did, right? Maybe it would be a model for us. And I couldn't answer any of those questions from the literature because nobody writes about colonial bureaucracies anymore. Right? That's totally old-fashioned. And the older literature, where that was all about that, was written by very racist people who talked about Indians as perpetual liars and so forth. So couldn't use that. And so off to the archives I went. The British Archives, the British Library, the archives at the University of Toronto, and this summer to the Gladstone Library in Wales, which is open 365 days a year, has a hotel, a restaurant, a coffee shop, and a bar. I am not coming back. So I went first to the British Archives, which was fantastic. I had been there for no man's land, but it had been modernized. There was latte. There were swans that banged on the doors outside. It was awesome. And the British, of course, saved everything. They saved everything, which is good and bad. They didn't seem to talk to the people whose welfare they were responsible for, but they sure as hell talked to each other, and they kept it all. And there was so much correspondence that some enterprising archivists in the 1830s had divided it all up, separating, for example, the official correspondence from the non-official correspondence, the outgoing mail from the incoming mail, the enclosures from the letters that enclosed them. So to try to follow any particular issue in the archives just for one colony would take you a lifetime. So I gravitated to the records of James Stephen, who was the son of Britain's most famous, one of the most famous evangelical abolitionists, who had the same name, just to confuse you. And he was, my John Stephen, the junior, was counsel to the Colonial Office from when he began as basically a gig worker in 1813 to when he was retired. He was permanent undersecretary in 1847. And it was his job to read every law passed in the British colonies and to make a recommendation as to whether that law should be allowed to stand or set aside by the Crown. So he knew about all kinds of stuff. And because he was a very serious abolitionist, he was pretty focused on labor concerns, and he recognized that indenture, the new indentured system, was meant to undermine the bargaining power of emancipated slaves. And so he opposed it. So looking through the lens of his very substantial literature, I could sort of see what happened in a way that didn't involve spending 30 years in Britain. Okay. It gave me a kind of critical bird's eye view of the whole British world. Okay, so here in a nutshell is what I found, both from the secondary literature and from the archives. The 19th century migration of Indians as indentured workers was initiated in the 1830s by plantation owners in Mauritius, which is like a tiny, tiny dot off the coast of Madagascar, which is off the coast of East Africa. I can't really see it, so I marked it. That was a new British colony. It had been a French colony. The planters were still French, and they started to import, because of the Emancipation Act, they started to import first convicts from India, and then supposedly free workers on indentured contracts. And over in Liverpool, in England, John Gladstone, the archive I'm going to, right? The father of the man who would become Prime Minister, William, he set off the migration of indentured workers in the Caribbean and Latin America. Because, again, he saw the writing on the wall. The Emancipation Act, Abolition Act is 1833. It goes into effect in 34. It creates like a temporary status where you're still bound to your slave owner, but only for 8 hours a day. And then after 6 years, it was supposed to end and everybody would be free. And he recognized that women would withdraw their labor from the fields. He was right. And he thought that men were very likely, quote, to form combinations to compel the planters to pay them wages at rates much above their means or ability to comply with. And so he wrote to the Secretary of State for the colonies and said what they need is free laborers to such an extent as may excite competition. It's not about replacing slaves. This is about bargaining them down. And he wrote to the Calcutta firm that was supplying Indians to Mauritius to see how it was going, and he was assured that, quote, the natives, being perfectly ignorant of the place they go or the length of the voyage they are undertaking, to be supplied. So much for free labor, right? That same old statement. So they get the British colonial secretary's thumbs up, and Gladstone sent 2 ships to India to collect workers with the expectation that they would sign 7-year indentures. It took a whole year to find enough people to get on 2 little ships that wanted to go all the way to the Caribbean. And it took a year to sail to British Guyana, the other side of the world from India. And by that time, the press had gotten wind of the whole scheme, and they were calling this new system of labor supply a new system of slavery, and publicizing stories of workers who had been tricked or coerced into migrating. Same as today. So the colonial office, before Gladstone's coolies land in British Guyana, they've imposed rules. No 7-year contracts, 2-year contracts. Officials have to read the contract in a language that the workers can understand, right, and make sure they actually agree. If a captain lets a worker on the boat who has not agreed, then he's going to be fined per worker and can be imprisoned for 30 days. The doctor had to register, the ship had to be registered, planters couldn't sell coolies from one planter to another, which was already happening, and so forth. And look at this, contracts had to specify the employer, the estate, the hours of labor, wages, rations, clothing, none of which Ebby really knew when he left India for the Gulf of Mexico. Right? And they would get free passage home after 5 years if they wanted to go. Okay. So this is a lot. That's kind of a lot of reforms. I thought that was pretty impressive, but it didn't work. In fact, an abolitionist investigator who went to British Guyana and arrived not long after Gladstone's workers did, saw some of them being flogged for trying to walk back to India. So they did indeed not know where they were. So on August 1st, 1838, the same day slavery ended for good, it was actually 2 years earlier than it was supposed to, but the same day slavery ended for good in most of the British Empire, indentured immigration was stopped. They just suspended it, pending an investigation, and it stayed suspended for 4 years. And And as Gladstone predicted, plantation managers were forced to bargain with their newly freed slaves. And they did so by using the stick and not the carrot, right? Charging rent for slave quarters, evicting freed people, plowing up their provision grounds, using their control of colonial legislatures to enact master-servant codes that aim to immobilize black labor as much as possible. Stephen was urging the colonial office to invalidate those laws, and they mostly do, but not before there were strikes, protests, and riots across the circle of Caribbean. So planters' crackdown succeeded in fulfilling Gladstone's prophecy. A decade after the Abolition Act, British Guyana's workforce is down by 43% because they scared people away and they went off and became, peasant farmers and so forth, found their own land. The major banks that had invested in the West Indies had collapsed. Plantation owners were selling their properties at fire sale prices. And even former abolitionists were starting to worry that if all this goes to hell, then how are we going to convince other empires to emancipate their slaves if our plantations are collapsing? And so by the time we get to the mid-1840s, the even of abolitionists are talking about coolies being necessary as a way to make sure that this whole thing, a positive good for all concerned. And so the British reauthorized indentured migration, but with more rules. So here they are. I'll just leave them up there. There's just more. So now contracts are down to 1 year. But the key here is that there's no more private recruitment. The British Colonial Office takes charge of the entire system of indentured migration. You can't be a captain of a ship without being in the British employ. You can't recruit anybody without being in Britain's employ. The whole thing was regulated. And they created a whole new sort of bureaucracy, protectors of immigrants in the sending colonies, protectors of immigrants in the receiving colonies, stipendiary magistrates who had originally been sent to deal with emancipated slaves, just like the Freedmen's Bureau, to like negotiate between the plantation managers and the emancipated people. Now those people had to deal with all the cases involving indentured workers as well. So Lord Stanley, who was the colonial secretary at the time, put immigration squarely under the control of the state rather than private recruiters. So they nationalized the whole kit with the word, imperialized it. I don't know, Julie, what's the word? There's nothing like this in the world today. Nothing, not even close. So did it work? And is it a model for us? Clearly, some indentured workers, many indentured workers, did well as Northrop said they did, but I'm not sure it was the regulations that did the trick. So for example, some of them pooled their wages. They did get paid, unlike our 18th century indentured workers. They had pay, and they would pool their money and buy defunct plantations off the British, right, and run them on their own. Northrop points out that in Mauritius, Indians made up less than 3% of professionals in 1851, but 25% of professionals in 1881. I'm not clear that those were ex-indentured people. Those may well have just been other migrants who came on their own, including Gandhi, for example, right, who arrives in Natal as an attorney and represents indentured workers. The death rates on the ships decline radically, but that's because the ships get faster, right? And you get a Suez Canal, so they can cut the time down hugely. There is, however, ample evidence that colonial officials who were charged with regulating this whole system strenuously and sincerely advocated for indentured migrants. Now, it's much like the Freedmen's Bureau, where you see some characters who are on one side, but there's lots and lots of evidence that they really tried, especially the stipendiary magistrates' reports. And they do as much as they can do among a very hostile planter class, just like here, in the American South. And the bird's eye view that I got by looking at Stephen's records suggests the extent of that hostility. So from the Caribbean to the Cape Colony to Mauritius, colonial legislators, dominated by planters, passed exactly the sort of master-servant codes that Stephen had gotten the British to set aside when it came to emancipating slaves. So they made minor violations of workers. Workers had civil contracts, right, with their employers. But if you broke one of those contracts, you went to jail. Flogging's not allowed anymore, but you go to jail. Just like if you broke your, you had a crop lien, right, and you tried to walk away from sharecropping contract, that's criminalized, right, over the course of the 19th century. Same sort of thing, but earlier. So anything from breaking a tool to insolence to sleeping in to striking becomes punishable by jail time. And that benefited employers because when the worker got out of jail, they doubled the days that they owed back to the employer. So vagrancy acts and pass laws enacted all over the British world, not just in South Africa, aimed to keep workers confined to the estates where they worked. And Stephen rejected these codes again and again and again, sometimes successfully, but he retired in 1847 and things fell apart. So just a couple of examples, I'm gonna wrap up soon. In British Guyana, in the last 2 decades of the 19th century, 30% of all coolies were convicted or imprisoned for offenses against their employer. 30%. Each year in Mauritius, in a decade between 1861 and 1871, 9% of indentured laborers were arrested for vagrancy in so-called coolie hunts, which were basically mass searches for runaways. Across the empire, year-long contracts gave way to 3-year contracts, and then to 5-year contracts, and then the return passage was free, but only after 10 years instead of 5 years. In 1851, Mauritius said, now you don't have the right to go, no free passage back at all, you can leave, but you had to pay for it. And by the end of the century, flogging by planters had been reauthorized across the British Empire. So no matter how vigorously the reformers defended migrants' rights and contracts, in other words, planters responded to that new regulatory regime by transforming Britain's sugar colonies the world over into a sort of carceral empire in which workers lived in constant fear of arrest and incarceration. Now, they didn't passively accept this. In fact, they were far more likely to strike and protest than Ebby and his co-workers, who were disciplined by the fear of deportation and the shackles of debt. And what I think I see in my stupid 800-page timeline is periodic drops in the price, like big drops in the price of sugar, and then planters would cut wages across the board, and then there will be a strike wave, and I'd love to say that those strike waves are the things that change things for the better, but alas, every time there was a strike wave, there'd be more of the sort of legislation that I just described, trying to crack down some more. The British keep sending royal commissions to investigate, they keep imposing new reforms, but that to me seems to just prolong the system rather than change the system. It gives the impression that it's better. So I'm still really depressing. So in 1896, half a century after Stanley's reforms, there was an unusually literate indentured migrant named Betchy, who wrote scathing editorials to British Guyana's newspapers about the mistreatment of immigrant workers. And he noted, for example, that he was able to read the contract, but noted that he traveled and was able to read it. He said, the immigrant comes here like a blind man. Ebby would utterly agree with that. The contract didn't matter anyway, because without enforcement, it was just words on a page, right? Betchy's contract limited the workday to 7 hours for 1 shilling, but they were actually required to work 12 hours for the same 1 shilling. The Jamaican guest workers that I wrote about in No Man's Land went to court and won an enormous lawsuit for exactly the same problem. Betchy criticized immigration officials for being too few. He never met one. Testifying before Congressional Committee, Ebby noted not a single person from this labor department came to where we worked or lived and conducted an inspection. Same old snake. Betchu criticized British officials for failing to learn the languages of the people that they were supposed to be protecting, and he noted wryly that the coolies were always called ignorant, but the officials that had worked with them for decades never learned their languages. Eddie called upon the Department of Labor to arrange for interpreters in advance of workers' arrival. Most importantly, Betchu noted the reforms didn't work because the state authorized system that was trying to regulate the conditions created the conditions of vulnerability that caused the problems in the first place. As long as indentured workers were being bound to particular employers by the state, right, no reforms were going to make any difference. Betchu said, men do not gather grapes from thorns, nor do they get reforms from officials and the system that created the need for reforms. Right on. Or, as Eddie put it, we are made especially vulnerable by the imbalance of power between workers and employers and the rules of the program. The state, in other words, is trafficker number one. Well, since my long trip into the 19th century, the signal case has seemed much less like a victory and more like another failed attempt to get grapes from thorns. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act proved so toothless that it had to be amended in 2003 so workers could sue their own employers for trafficking. They could sue their own traffickers because nobody was doing it. No state officials, there's so few cases in the aftermath of this law. And while the workers eventually got the T visas, and they now live in, houses like this one. This is outside of Houston. It took years. Eddie met his son for the first time, as I said, when his kid was 4 and a half. I went to Pascagoula and I was with my sister, and she was in the back with, I was in the front with the former signal worker. He was showing me the shipyard, and my sister was in the back with his wife. And I said to the worker, how many years were you separated from your family? And he said 6. My sister told me later that his wife was in the back doing 7. I didn't hear it, but she told me that. Outraged by Eddie's story, the president of the Texas AFL-CIO said, I hope when the signal guy gets caught, he serves in a cell with 24 other people. But no one spent time in cells as a result of this case except the workers when they were arrested by ICE for working once they left Signal by taking jobs without a legal visa. And yet it's not just a question of US officials failing to provide oversight, right? Given the nature, as I said, of our guest worker program, it's the state that's also the trafficker. US officials put the stickers on the Social Security card that said you can only work for that employer. County sheriffs helped to deport workers when employers called, even though workers had valid visas in their hands. The federal official who headed the investigation into Signal's case was the same Customs and Border Patrol official who had advised Signal to deport the workers' leaders and make sure everybody saw, which is why they did it at shift change. Since the workers' $20 million victory, which they didn't get, by the way, some states have heeded the workers' advice by creating state officials whose job it is to check on the federal guest workers in their state and to make sure they're being treated properly. But here in Georgia, 2 of those officials, we're not in Georgia, we're not in Louisiana. In Georgia, where I live, 2 of those officials were recently indicted for taking payoffs from traffickers to not do their jobs. So, to conclude, avaricious employers and piratical recruiters, those same old snakes are always going to exist. Focusing on them as the problem distracts us from the ways in which states create the conditions of vulnerability that makes the snake's bite particularly dangerous. Thank you. something to do.
Let's have some questions
Yeah.
and discussion.
I always tell my students, you wait 8 seconds, and you'll ask a question. Yeah. There you go, see.